4 of us went into the Merrick Works on the 9th of October. 3 didn't come back out. I still don't know which of them to grieve is murdered, and which is just gone somewhere that isn't quite dead. The channel posted the footage 2 days after they pulled me out at the river gate. Posting the footage is what the channel does. 41 minutes, 11 million views last time I checked. People have gone frame by frame through every second of it looking for the moment it resolves, and there isn't one. I've watched it more than any of them. I know where every clang in the dark lines up with every shape that might be a shoulder, might be a support beam catching the light wrong. I still can't tell you if a man built himself a body count at the Merrick Works, or if the works kept a man around to take the blame for what it does on its own. I can only tell you what the 4 of us saw. We ran a channel called Vacant Signal. It was 3 years old. Built on the promise that we'd get inside places most people only saw in drone footage, and something would happen while the camera was rolling. I built that promise. I'm the one who stood in front of derelict hospitals at 2 in the morning and said I felt something behind me, when what I mostly felt was the cold and the weight of the gimbal rig on my shoulder. My brother Jesse ran sound and thought the whole format was a con we were running on people who wanted to be scared for free. He said it to my face, and on camera, more than once. I kept the cuts in because the arguing tested well. He still showed up for every shoot. He'd been doing the pre-entry check since we were teenagers, sneaking into the Ridgeline paper plant back home. Walking a crowbar out ahead of him to test a floor joist before either of us put weight on it. He wasn't going to stop just because he decided the ghosts were fake. He was the reason I'd walked out of every derelict building we'd ever shot in. Roman believed all of it, no performance in him anywhere. He carried an EMF meter he'd paid $400 for and trusted with his life. Sasha was the newest member of the team. We hired her to edit. She ended up in front of the camera because she was the one who'd go one room further than anybody else wanted to. She had a rule she said out loud on every shoot, that the last room in any building was where the real footage lived. We crossed the Cass River into Ferris County a little after 4 that afternoon. A county cruiser sat at the far end of the bridge. The deputy stepped out and leaned into my window before we'd even cleared the rail, Halloran on the tag over his pocket. He looked past me at the gears stacked in the back seat and said the mill wasn't worth it. He said it flat, like he'd said it to other people before us and it hadn't worked on them either. Roman got most of it on a lav mic. We called Halloran the crank in the group chat before we were even off the bridge. Free B-roll, Jesse said, and meant it as a joke. We hadn't come looking for a man named Merrick. We'd come for a building. 4 stories of brick and broken sawtooth roofline. Standing over the river with Merrick Works still legible on the water tower, if you squinted. The name found us on its own. A brass plate screwed to an office door on the 2nd floor. It was green everywhere except where a hand had kept it wiped clean. A. Merrick, plant manager. Then a service award photo behind that same door. It showed a man in a collared shirt with a face so ordinary none of us could have picked him out of a lineup. It was dated 1958 in a jeweler's stamp along the bottom. Roman wanted it to be a haunting from the first nameplate. Jesse wanted it to be nothing. Said every dead mill has a manager's name on a door somewhere, and that's not a story. The thing that stopped him for a minute was the ledger. We found it in a records room on the 3rd floor, spine cracked. The handwriting on the first page matched the handwriting on the last page. The dates between them ran 40 years apart. The shift tallies never once added up to the number of names listed under them, not on one single page. None of us could decide if that was just bad bookkeeping or something else. Roman did the math on the dates out loud and grinned like he'd won something. Jesse said there were 2 Merricks, father and son. The handwriting was similar because a man learns his father's handwriting, sometimes on purpose. Then Sasha turned to the very last entry, a shift tally, dated 11 days before we walked in. Nobody argued that one for a while. We kept finding a building that had a person it didn't need. A hallway light at the far end of a corridor came on while we were 50 feet from any switch we could find, and the lights stayed on after we checked every one of them. Jesse said it was an old wiring shorting on a loop. Roman filmed it in total silence. I heard the audio later. He was praying under his breath, low, the kind that isn't a performance for a camera. I called it content gold, out loud, into my own lav mic. The way I called everything on every shoot, and Jesse gave me a look for it that I'm still working out how to describe. Not anger, something closer to disappointment landing on a person he'd already decided not to expect better from. The room that got to all four of us was smaller than either of those. A supervisor's break room off the boiler floor, and in it a cot with a blanket folded at the foot, and on the shelf a coffee tin still half full. None of it under the dust that owned every other surface in that building. Someone had been sleeping there, recently. Whoever or whatever it was, it kept house. We found the catwalk over the main floor a little after full dark, and that's when the works did the thing that's on every clip anyone's ever cut from this video. Below us, 100 feet of dead machinery, looms and rollers that hadn't turned since before any of us were born. Then, one stretch of it wasn't dead. A conveyor 30 feet down running an empty belt in a slow loop, a bank of work lights holding a weak amber glow over it, steam breathing out of a joint that should have been bone dry for decades. Down at the far end of that lit stretch, small with distance, one shape moved along the line the way a man moves when he's checking a station he's checked 10,000 times before. Roman had the camera up before any of us said a word. None of us could tell if that shape was walking the belt or being carried by it. None of us could tell if we were looking at a dead building coming back to itself for reasons that had nothing to do with us, or one man, still doing his shift, still checking his stations. 40 years after everyone else clocked out for good. Jesse's hand found my shoulder up there, and he didn't say it was fake. That's the part he'd have denied later, if he'd gotten a later. We took the stairwell down to get closer, because that was always going to be the decision we made. On the second landing, something let go above us. A length of pipe came off the wall in the dark and took the rail out an arm's length from where Sasha stood, close enough that she felt the wind off it. Jesse had the mounting bracket in his hand 30 seconds later, rusted clean through, and said that's what 50-year-old iron does when 4 people start putting their weight on a structure never rated for tourists. Roman said the angle was wrong for a fall, that the pipe had come off the wall sideways, like something had thrown it down the stairwell shaft instead of it simply letting go. He wasn't wrong about the angle. Neither of them could make the other one wrong about the way they saw it. 2 flights down, Roman put a boot through decking that looked as solid as anything else on that floor, and dropped to his waist before Jesse got a hand under his arm. Jesse said rot, pointed at daylight-colored wood dust still hanging in the beam of his light. Roman said the boards on either side of the hole were fine, that only the one board under his foot had gone, and asked, which kind of rot does that? That was the first time the group split on a single event, and stayed split on it, out loud, mid-shoot. Jesse wanted to call it, pack it in, said the place had a squatter with a grudge and code violations. Roman wanted to push forward, said we'd never get closer to proof than we were right then. I said we'd keep going, because I'd built this channel to walk toward exactly this kind of disagreement. Some part of me I'm not proud of was already thinking about how the disagreement itself would cut in the final video. Sasha didn't weigh in either way. She was already 10 feet down the next corridor, with her light on the floor in front of her, listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear yet. We lost Sasha on the 4th floor, in the finishing room. The ceiling had come down in 3 places and left column-sized gaps you could put a hand through. She was 10 feet ahead of the rest of us, chasing a sound she swore was a second set of footsteps under our own. Roman heard it too. Jesse didn't, or said he didn't. We came around a baling machine the size of a delivery truck, and she wasn't there. Her light was, sitting upright on a shelf, like she'd set it down on purpose. It was aimed at a gap in the floor, wide enough for a body, dark enough that our lights didn't find a bottom in it. Jesse got down at the edge and called her name until his voice gave out. He argued the whole time that the floor down here was as rotten as anything we'd already seen, that she'd been moving too fast to test it the way he tests everything. Roman wouldn't come near the edge. He said no sound leads a person 10 feet ahead of a group unless it means to. Said something had wanted her that far out in front and taken her the second it had the room to itself. The hallway behind us didn't look like the hallway we remembered coming down. We spent the better part of an hour rigging a line down into that gap with whatever we had. Camera straps knotted to a tripod leg, and it never found a floor. Jesse wanted to lower himself in after her. Roman physically stood in front of the hole to stop him. For the first time all night, the fight wasn't about what was doing this. It was just two men who both wanted to be the one who went down and got her. Neither of them did. We never found which one of them was right about how she'd gone. We never found her. Jesse found the loading dock stair on the way back, a straight run to a door with a strip of real night showing under it. Cold, outside air we could feel from 30 feet off. For a few minutes it felt decided. We were leaving, calling it in from the truck, letting someone with a badge and a search team go back in for Sasha in daylight. Jesse had his hand on the bar before he'd even reached it, already talking about which highway patrol post was closest. The door was locked from a side that had no lock on it, not swollen shut, not rusted. We checked. Locked. Jesse hit it twice with his shoulder, then just stood there with his palm flat against the steel. None of us said out loud what that meant. Something in this building had decided we weren't done yet. We found another way down through the boiler house, and that's where we lost Jesse. A valve gantry ran above the old accumulator tank, a catwalk maybe 2 feet wide with a single handrail. Jesse crossed it first, some habit left over from testing floors for me 20 years ago that he'd never once broken. Halfway across, a steam main that had no business being pressurized let go at a coupling 6 feet from him. That boiler hadn't fired since the plant closed. Roman kept saying it after, like saying it enough times would undo what we'd watched. The line blew in a wall of scalding white and put Jesse down on the catwalk, and by the time Roman and I got across to the wheel and shut the flow off, the sound Jesse had been making had already stopped sounding human. When the steam cleared enough to see, my brother wasn't on the catwalk anymore. Not below it either, not in the tank, nowhere. Roman's light couldn't find him in the time we spent trying. The wheel that shut that line off was warm under my hand when I got to it. Warm, and gripped clean of 40 years of grime in a hand-shaped patch on the rim. Somebody's hand does that to a valve. Machines don't turn themselves warm. I don't have a clean understanding of that night anymore. I have Jesse's hand on my shoulder on the catwalk above the running conveyor, not 2 hours earlier, telling me, without saying it, that even he wasn't sure what was happening. I have the sound he made. I have a valve wheel somebody had used, gripped and turned and left warm. No one should have been in that building to have turned it. After that, I became my brother. I took up the argument he couldn't finish, and I would not let it go. It was a man. It had always been a man, some squatter who'd made a life out of this building and a game out of the four of us. Every single thing we'd filmed had a simple explanation. I said it to Roman on the stairs that we'd going up. The theory being that up was away from the boiler house and away from anything with a valve wheel in it. I said it loud enough that saying it felt like doing something. The alternative was that my brother had died because I built a channel that made walking into buildings like this one feel like content instead of what it actually was, and I was not ready to face that yet, so I carried his argument instead. We found the record room on the top floor by accident. We were looking for a way onto the roof. Filing cabinets, most drawers water-damaged past reading, except one folder somebody had kept dry on purpose, boxed, shelved above the flood line. County inspection paperwork from the 1987 closure. One line near the bottom of the cover sheet, typed, not handwritten. Sole surviving officer, A. Merrick, Jr., deceased, 1974. No heirs of record. There was no living Merrick to have written in that ledger 11 days before we came in. There was no man left for Jesse's argument to be about. I stood there, wanting it to prove the other thing instead, and it wouldn't do that either. It didn't hand me a ghost. It took away the last man I had to blame and gave me nothing back in his place. Somewhere below us, faint enough that I told myself it was wind finding a broken window, something that sounded like a shift's worth of footsteps started up again. The tally in my head still didn't add up to one man, same as it never had. Roman and I ran the rest of the way together, and I use the word run loosely, because most of it was crawling through gaps the ceiling had made for us and hoping the floor under each one was better than the floor that had taken Sasha. The lights kept doing what they'd been doing all night, on ahead of us where no one had touched a switch, off behind us the second we'd cleared a room, walking us down a route neither of us had picked. That didn't match the route we'd mapped coming in. Roman kept saying it was herding us out, that it wanted us gone. For the first time all night, I started to believe him. Twice on the way down, a door we'd left propped was shut when we reached it. Both times we found another way around. We both noticed, but never said anything about it. I lost him at the last gate. A rolling door, chain and pulley, half down. Roman went under it first to work the chain from the other side for me. I heard the chain run and the door come down the rest of the way. It seemed to come down faster than gravity should have dropped it. Roman didn't call out from the far side. I hauled it back up myself. I cut my hands on the links. When the door finally came up, there was no one there. Just the yard, the fence, the river past that. There was a shape standing at the gap in the fence where we'd cut in 8 hours before. Tall, at the exact place I needed to go through, not moving toward me and not moving away. I had 2 seconds of light on it before my battery finally gave out. In those 2 seconds, it did one thing: stepped aside from the gap, just enough that a body my size could get through it without touching whatever it was. The footage cuts here. Battery, or something else that wanted it to end. I don't remember the run to the road. I remember Halloran's cruiser lights, parked in the same spot on the bridge. It was like he'd been sitting there since we crossed it going the other way. He didn't ask what happened. He looked like a man who'd already had a good idea of how the night was going to end. The footage went up 2 days later. I'd like to tell you I fought that. I didn't. Not hard enough to mean anything. It's the best 41 minutes vacant signal ever shot. I know exactly how that sounds coming out of the one person in it who's still around. People ask me in the comments whether it was Merrick, whether it was ever a man at all, whether my brother's skepticism got him killed or got him vindicated. I still don't have an answer for them. I go back to the footage more nights than I'd admit, always looking for the one frame that finally settles it, something that proves him right or proves him wrong. It just isn't in there. It was never going to be in the footage. Somebody posted a second angle last month, a doorbell camera 2 properties down from the bridge, time-stamped the night we went in. It shows the 4 of us crossing. It shows Halloran's cruiser. 40 minutes later, on a night none of the rest of us were anywhere near that stretch of road, it shows one more person crossing the bridge alone, heading towards the mill. I've watched that clip more than I've watched anything Roman or Jesse ever shot. I can't tell you if it's Merrick, walking to a shift he never clocked out of. I haven't looked in a mirror at 4 in the morning since I found that clip. I checked the view count instead. It's still climbing. It'll probably still be climbing after I'm done telling you this. He's got 2 versions of that night now. The one where a man did all of it, and the one where the building never needed one. To this day, he still isn't certain which is the truth. That's where we'll leave it tonight. If this story kept you company out there in the dark, please like and subscribe, and join us for the next journey into Hollow County. Got a story of your own? A place you only went into for the footage that ended up wanting something back? Email it to us. We may just tell it here someday. And if you're ever the last one out of some old building at night, and you look back to see one light still on in a room you already checked, don't go back.